Welcome to Cross-Examining Cyber, a podcast brought to you by Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer. In this podcast series, we talk to those industry leaders on the cyber frontline, protecting companies from cyber incidents and shaping the legal and regulatory environment. I'm Cam Whitfield, leader of our APAC cyber practice. In this episode, we continue our discussion with Ciaran Martin. We go beyond introductions and go deep on cybersecurity, cyber strategy, incident response, preparing for an incident, and legal support during a crisis. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is Cross-Examining Ciaran Martin, Part 2. Here we go. Ciaran, you played a significant role in developing our strategy here in Australia. What did your role entail, and what does a good cyber security strategy look like?
I did know some valued colleagues in the Australian cybersecurity system. You've had some of them on your podcast already, but as a Five Eyes partner, long been impressed and highly valued the Australian government and security services cyber capabilities. When I first came to Australia with CyberCX, by complete coincidence, it was the Monday morning when Medibank announced that they weren't going to pay the ransom, and that led to a week of, that was the most intensive scrutiny and controversy around Australian cybersecurity that ever been.
Yeah.
I was in Canberra. Actually, I was asked by various media outlets to try and explain what, a data extortion ransomware attack was, etc., and how these things would look. I mean, obviously I knew the ASD and ACSC people very well, but I ended up talking to Home Affairs colleagues, and eventually that led to Claire O'Neill asking me to help out. So, I mean, it was your classic advisory role, the policy work and the consultation and the engagement with industry and business and so forth, and community groups in Australia was all done by the government. But there were two advisory groups, one which was more intensive and detailed, chaired by Andy Penn, which was domestic Australians, and the other, it was me, Admiral Mike Rogers, former head of the NSA, Dmitry Alperovich, founder of CrowdStrike, and Suzanne Spalding, former senior US government cyber policy official. We would look at drafts, we would look at policy choices, and we would debate them amongst ourselves. There'd be reports and so forth, and then we would check in with the minister every few months during that process. So we absolutely didn't decide policy. That would be inappropriate for foreigners, but we gave advice. In terms of what does a good strategy look like? Well, I think the Australian strategy, the 6 pillars that came out, what does hit the mark for a good strategy? I think there are probably a few things that really matter. One is just focusing on some specific and tangible improvements that you can make. It's such a complicated, multifaceted problem. There's a tendency to try to draw up some conceptual framework that's going to solve everything, and that's where you get into public-private partnerships and information sharing and so forth. So just say, right, how do you do a significant reduction in privately owned critical infrastructure risk? I think the Australian thing does that. How are you going to handle incidents, and what sort of framework do you need? How active are you going to be? Where are you going to draw the line between the public and private sector involvement? Because one of the challenges in cybersecurity is there's an awful lot of public-facing risk in private hands. Medibank's a really good example of that, private company, but it ends up being frankly a national security crisis and so on. I mean, an example of a clear choice. Australia is in a position to help allied but poorer and less capable countries build up their cybersecurity. Which ones are you going to do? And there's an active choice to do the Pacific Islands and nearby. Yeah. Other choices were available, but the important thing is the choice was made. So I think that's the most important point. The second most important thing, which I think again reflects pretty well on the Australian side, is there's a clear appreciation of economics, of the importance of law and legal frameworks. When you're not going to legislate, and I think although cybersecurity acts come in, there was a lot of very thorough scrutiny saying, look, let's not just reach for the statute book to do this. What are the factors in terms of incentives, etc., and where do you actually need legal change? And then I think the third thing is trying to put liability where it belongs. And this is really important. One of the gravest errors we've made in our field has been we've almost inverted the pyramid of liability. So we've said the humble user clicking on a link is the weakest link. Well, that must be nonsense. I mean, the example I always use is the Irish healthcare system in 2021. It is now clear, there's abundant evidence that one who are probably underpaid but overpressurized healthcare worker clicked on a link. It's not that person's fault that the national healthcare system collapsed. That's a systemic issue. And it's not just a systemic issue for the leadership of the organization. It's the fact that they were using a system of software that was quite buggy.
Yeah.
And there's no liability there. So I think, for example, some of the stuff around IoT security, because again, hardware security is easier to secure than software, but some of the reforms on IoT, which mirror those made in the UK, Singapore, the EU, other places, I think are very, very good. So those three things, actually focusing on some specific sort of risk mitigations, realizing the different role of incentives, corporate behavior, psychology, human behavior, behavioral science, and legal reform. And then thirdly, trying to get sort of liability where it is. I think those things are all very important in a strategy. The worst thing, which I think we've done in the past, is just sit back and declare a framework and say to people, off you go. That doesn't work. I mean, it's an interesting thing, having seen my fair share of classic right-wing versus left-wing politics, all my life. Outside of the US, where I think it is different for all sorts of reasons, size and the fact that it's the home of most of the tech industry that we use. Outside of the US, whether it's Britain, Australia, Western Europe, and so forth, the classic thing was business telling government to get out of the way doesn't happen in cyber.
Yeah.
Actually, I had various business leaders saying, you couldn't just come in and take over this function. I was thinking, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
How do you keep yourself up to speed with those sort of things that are impacting corporates on the ground?
I think I've got probably two answers. One is the private sector work that I do. I'm not here to sell anybody anything or plug any company, but, with work like CyberCX, one of the reasons why the university, is quite comfortable with me doing private sector work is that is, in this field, access to industry capabilities and the experience of industry and incident management and so forth is one way to keep relevant. The other much more personal explanation, because I think that's the way in which a lot of people stay relevant, is that because of my previous role as the sort of, national figurehead on cybersecurity, the British media still tend to use me a lot when significant incidents or controversies about cyber happen. And the discipline of having to go on in front of millions of people to explain something means that some prior research to make sure you know what you're talking about is advisable. So that does, I hope, keep me fresh. And then obviously just read a lot and you try and talk to people and maintain your networks and so on. And taking on tasks like, for example, the Australia strategy a few years ago, I think helps. How can people let you help? If I go back to TalkTalk way back in 2014, having been implicitly critical of them in terms of how the breach happened, I would say that their post-incident transparency was both exemplary and really important, because you had a CEO, Dido Harding, now Baroness Harding, going around telling other CEOs that this is what happened, this is what it felt like, this is how it happened, why, with things to watch out for. That's very, very valuable. And I think that there is a tendency, and often, whether fairly or unfairly, at least part of the blame is levelled at the legal profession. There is a tendency to say nothing to see here and no details, etc. And I would say, if you look back, I'm sure you can find one or two counter examples to rebut my point, but I think it's more true than untrue. Look back over 15 years of major cyber incidents. Look at the companies who've been really transparent about it and open and helpful, and show me the detriment they suffered by so doing. It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And actually, in terms of goodwill from the cyber community, I mean, obviously you can't be completely transparent about everything, but I think that should help. I think governments can then therefore help, in terms of the legal framework. I mean, when in Australia, and I'm sure this is a sensitive area for you as it is for me, but, I think that the legal cases about Optus and Medibank will be important in terms of setting legal risk appetites. And I do worry sometimes about overly onerous data protection regulations for two reasons. One, the one we've just been discussing, whether it acts as a chilling effect in terms of people's willingness to be transparent, but actually more importantly, I think that, and again, Ireland's healthcare system is a good example. Data breaches are bad, but there are things that are worse, such as the inability to provide healthcare. Here's a thought experiment for Australians. What if they'd actually locked Medibank out of their system so they couldn't actually, I'm assuming, I'm not an expert in the Australian healthcare system, but I'm assuming if you locked Medibank out, that there would have been significant slowing down of scheduling operations and things like that. That's worse than a data breach. But if your laws only say protect personal data, which is what most countries' laws say, And that's in Ireland in 2021. Essentially, if you look at the period before the attack and put yourself in the position of being the cyber protection team of the health services executive, they had one legal obligation, and it was not to make sure that they were able to schedule life-saving operations. It was to protect patient data. That's insane, right?
Yeah.
So that's a long-winded answer, including bringing in things you didn't even ask me about. But I think in terms of, helping us all stay relevant, I think there is a thing around transparency around incidents, but there's also a thing about, in order to make that happen, there is an onus on government to make sure that the legal framework incentivizes it.
We have not, in this country, seen a material, operational, or asset integrity compromise, and that's probably our biggest fear. Data, I don't want to downplay it. It's important, but it's largely manageable. Operational or asset integrity, where we're talking a whole different ballgame here. So for me, that's probably my biggest fear, and we're yet to confront that materially. So,
and when it happens, it hurts.
This whole conundrum about extortion demands, pay, don't pay, outlaw or make unlawful payment, make exceptions, etc. We went through that debate here. Yeah. What's your view on that, and how do you think that's going to unfold over the next 3, 4, 5 years?
Easier to answer what my view is rather than make a prediction. So my view, it's quite hawkish, but it's a bit nuanced. So firstly, let me split it into two. There are two types of ransom demands. There are, essentially data extortion, Medibank. We're going to release all these files if you don't pay. And there's lockout, which is your system's not working and you're going to bleed money, and potentially literally if it's a hospital, unless you pay. Let me take the first one. Even if governments decide that they're just not interested in this issue, I think as a matter of business, and I know this is provocative and I know a lot of people will disagree, there are, to my mind, almost, in fact, possibly no circumstances at all that it ever makes sense to pay a ransom. It's bluff. What happens in these cases? I
don't think that's provocative, by the way.
Okay.
I think, and I believe the statistics will demonstrate that very few organisations that are dealing with simply a data incident will not pay.
A few years ago, that was much less true. Lots were paying. Yeah. And actually, I think Medibank's courage and the Australian people's courage in facing down Medibank was crucial in that. I go all over the world and people ask me about this, and I say, if Australia can cope with Medibank without paying, you can cope with your supplier list going on the dark web, right? Yeah. So I think Australia's resilience in the face of Medibank was one of the most important moments in that story. And I know that there are some unconfirmed but troubling cases, but when you think of the scale of that data breach, it is quite clear more than 3 years on that large-scale harm against the Australian public did not happen as a result of standing up to that. And I think that's a really, really important point. Because what happens in this case, well, they take a copy of your data. You still got the data, so you're still completely functional, as Medibank was throughout the whole crisis. In terms of operations and payments, it was all working fine. So they take your data and they say, we're going to publish it. And of course they did in very horrible ways. But they publish it somewhere where most people don't know how to find it, where, again, in terms of social capital and resilience, nothing to do with cyber. But what do the Australian media do? They said, we're not going to look at this. We're not going to broadcast the Prime Minister's medical records. And other prominent Australians said, I'm in the Medibank files. But the media said, we're not interested in this. The AFP said, well, if you exploit this data, you're probably committing a crime and we're going to come after you. And they implied that they would be doing covert operations, looking at who was looking at this data and so forth. So in other words, Australia did a brilliant job in terms of publicly accessing the data on the dark web. They made it useless. Okay. Yes. Now, was it commercially useless to the hackers? No, because they could sell it on for fraud and crime, but they could do that anyway. Because what we know is, and the best example of this is when the British police took down Lockbit, what did they find? They found all these people who'd paid, the data hadn't
None of the data deleted.
Yeah. Right. So what's the point in paying? Let's just take ethics, morality, law out of this. Let's make this a business decision. And if you want an example of something that drove me completely nuts, the Economist Intelligencer magazine, I love The Economist, but they wrote this awful puff piece in praise of a ransomware negotiator, where it was some American, I think it may have been a law firm, gets done over and they're all panicking, and it's a $2 million ransom. And this cool as a cucumber ransomware negotiator from some Pacific island beach gets them down to $175,000. Isn't that amazing? No, because the correct answer was don't pay anything, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have suffered any harm, any further harm than you already did. So I think that, I suppose there's always the odd exception. So you've got the horrible Vastama hack in Finland where people suffered serious harm, etc., etc. But, those examples are relatively rare, and certainly paying for routine corporate hacks it's just a waste of money. So I'd ban that in a heartbeat if I was in charge. Lockout is harder because there is an actual business model. It's not a bluff. It's a product. It's a decryptor key and so forth. Yeah. So here, and I have some sympathy with the Australian, because I think, it was quite obvious at the time that Australian ministers were thinking quite seriously about it and then decided to go for the notification rather than the ban. Yeah. I think it's more complicated. However, one of the things that, and I think the British government's doing some of this work, but we'll see where it goes. One of the things that slightly annoyed me was that I think we took too much of a cue from the US on this, and the US is a very different culture. Americans have sort of looked me in the eye and said it's immoral to enact a ransomware ban because, companies can go out of business and it's their right to pay their way out of trouble. Well, I live in a country where, and indeed in my own career, we had to deal with very harrowing cases in my pre-cyber career where British citizens got killed, murdered by terrorists, and we had made it illegal for their families to pay their kidnappers. So, the state was prepared to take a very tough line on, this type of criminal and terrorist ecosystem when it came to life and death. So, just mentally, I'm not attuned to the whole, there's an inalienable moral right to pay criminals so they commit more crime. I don't think there is. However, you can much more easily see cases, individual cases, where the consequences are horrible. And therefore the least worst option may be to pay, unless you do something about it. So here, let's take healthcare. Go back to the Irish example. National healthcare crisis. They don't pay. Eventually they get out of trouble. Contrast that with the US, where US hospitals pay all the time. Why did Ireland resist and America always pays? Nearly always pays. It's because of the structure of the healthcare systems. Now, I'm not advocating for socialized medicine, but what I'm saying is the Irish is a state body. So the decisions are taken at political level. It was the Prime Minister and his cabinet. And they gather around a table and they say, right, what's in the strategic national interest? Well, the strategic national interest is not to pay, because otherwise criminals will keep coming back and they'll do every Irish public authority until we've none left. Okay. So what do we do instead? Well, we're a government. We've a lot of resources. So we'll bring in the army, we'll bring in all the major American and other cybersecurity firms, and we'll throw the kitchen sink at it, which is what they did, right? If you're running a hospital in Chicago or wherever, what is your accountability? It's to your board of directors and your patients. It's not to the wider public interest. And you can't afford to bring in the US Army and the NSA and so on. You can't afford to bring in 6 major cybersecurity companies. You're on your own. So you pay, right? So what's the lesson of that? It's not to socialize American medicine. I'm not mad. It is to try to think about what type of framework of government support or insurance or whatever it is do you need to make a ban work? And if I'm going to be critical of governments, not the Australian government, because I think they tried, partly because of the tone set in America, governments have just said, oh, it's too difficult. No, it's not. Do some work. We've done this for terrorism. We've done this for flooding. What sort of system where you don't have the moral hazard of, saying to the companies you don't have to do anything because the government's got your back, but at the same time, you don't leave people completely on their own if they're unlucky enough to do something. So I think doing a data extortion ban is a simple line in the law saying you can't do it, right? I don't think that would work. If you wrote that into for lockout encryption, it would be a disaster.
Yeah.
But if you actually did some serious work, way beyond my area of expertise, because it involves insurance, backstops, whatever it is, if you did some serious work on what a support framework would like, you might get to a ban. So I think we should try to make a ban work.
And I think we're on our way there, I think.
Yeah.
I think we're on our way there.
So that probably answers the second question, because I went on too long, but I think we'll get there, but it'll take a while.
Yeah. Ciaran, I'm a legal professional. I'm a partner in a law firm. I find myself at the front and center of these incidents all the time, probably, to be honest with you, because of this ridiculous long tail that comes from these very sticky decisions that happen very quickly. What, in your view, makes a great lawyer? in cyber incident response?
Oh, what a good question. Two things. One do and one don't. The do is focus on the absolute big picture of recovery and getting back on your feet. The don't is shut other people out. Don't lock the place down. The cybersecurity ecosystem, in terms of response, isn't predatory. It's actually quite constructive. A lot of people want to help.
Yeah.
And there's an instinct in legal circles sometimes to assume hostility from outsiders. And I think this goes beyond law, but it's often a tone sort of aided by general counsel. In my post-government life, and even in my government life, you'd run a lot of exercises, and this goes beyond law. But let's say you're running a cyber incident exercise for a major company, and they're actually really good, and they're really well prepared, and you're thinking, oh God, how am I going to justify whatever I'm charging or whatever, because I'm not adding any value. The fail-safe way to screw them over is introduce a factor from outside the organization that they cannot control, right? An offer of help from the police, an activity from a partner, and say, well, they can't do that. Well, they can, and they just have, right? There's this obsession with control as if the organization is an isolated island, and it isn't. And organizations forgo help because they think, well, but then they'll put this organization under some sort of subpoena and deposition order in court, so we can't bring them in. Well, actually, they might be able to be quite helpful, and so on. Or we can't talk to this organization that might be able to help because of legal jeopardy and so on. It doesn't work in my view, and that's why the do is focusing on the big picture, because it might help you get out of the problem much quicker and much more effectively. And even if that's a modestly enhanced legal risk, it might well be worth it. That makes sense.
That makes sense. That's great counsel. I loved the way that question challenged you, to be honest with you, because it challenges many people in this profession as well. I'm firmly of the belief that lawyers should play a role which doesn't create friction in that process. Ciaran, I'm gonna let you go about your day. Can I just say a couple of things? First of all, congratulations on just a remarkable career. I mean, you talk about things as if they happened in yesteryear, but really they're quite recent, your experiences, and so your relevance remains significant. You've got a global brand that exists through your name and your name alone, and I think that's significant. And the fact that you played a significant role here in creating our cybersecurity strategy, I think we're very grateful for. And I love your sense of humour. Your sense, if we can have more people like you, this is a serious matter, but we have to sort of look at it through a lens which is sort of edible, essentially. And so, thank you for doing that. I'm very grateful.
You're very kind. Thank you. It's lovely to see you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right. Take care, my friend.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
We now pivot slightly. For the next few months, we are running a series of podcasts with our key directors. We talk about governing through a cyber crisis. And next time, we cross-examined David Moffat, Chair of Ventia. And then we cross-examined David Gonski, Anne Templeman-Jones, Catherine Brenner, John Mullen. The list goes on. A cracking series. This is Cross-Examining Cyber. Thanks again for listening.